Kurte Sikha is Chelek Yud Zayin Behar Beis. The Siyum is also a Siyum. The Sikha is also a Siyum on Masechta Shvius. So we're going to learn about Shemitah, the various different elements in Shemitah. Shemitah of Karka, Shemitah of Ksofim, Shemitah of money. And we're also going to gain a new understanding in the final two Mishnahs of Masechta Shvius. Mishnayos Masechta Shvius. We're learning Lili Nishmis, Rabbi Yosef ben Yamin ben Reb Menashe Kaltman. By the mitzvah from Shvisas Haaretz in Shvius, Zog der Rambam. So you have a mitzvah of Shvisas Haaretz, which means that to not engage in agricultural work during the 7th year, the year of Shvius. The Rambam says, mitzvah say lishbois mevedas Haaretz. It's a mitzvah say to rest, to cease from working the land, va'avedas ilon, and working with the trees. Bashana Shvius in the 7th year, shenemar, like the pasuk says, which is from this week's parsha, v'shav sa haaretz Shabbos la Hashem. The land should rest. A resting year for Hashem. Benemar, there's another pasuk. This is a parshas Kisisa. Becharish ubekotzer tishbois. You should rest, or you should cease from plowing and harvesting. Is you're doing them the chakira? There's a famous discussion, a famous debate on this mitzvah. Tzi the mitzvah is as the erd zol sheiv sein. Is the mitzvah that the earth, that the land should not be worked? This is mashma from Lashon HaKsuvim Parshaseinu. V'shav ha'oretz Shabbos la'Hashem. Shabbos and Yiyah la'oretz. Shna Shabbos and Yiyah la'oretz. Is it a mitzvah on the earth, as these psukim imply that it's about the oretz, that the oretz should rest? It should be a Shna Shabbosin for the oretz, for the land. Wie the Rambam sagt in an ander art, and in the wording of the Rambam in another place. This is in the list of mitzvahs that the Rambam writes as he introduces the halachis of Shemitah v'Yovel, as the mitzvah is tishbeis ha'aretz b'shvius mimalachta, that the earth should rest from its work on Shvius. Obviously, it means the person should not work the land, but is the mitzvah on the land, that the land should not be worked? Or the mitzvah is as their mensch darfruim avedas aretz, or is the mitzvah on the person that the person should rest from working v'dalosh nakasav? And here too, there's a pasuk that supports this side of the debate. Becharishu bekotzer tishbois. You, the person, should rest from plowing or harvesting. Umidalosh naramam analan, like the Ramam that we brought from the beginning of Hilchas Shemitah v'Yovel in the beginning of the Sikha here, lishbois, to rest, may avedas aretz, from working the land, v'avedas silon, or working the trees, with the trees. So both in the wording of the Rambam and in the psukim that speak about Shemitah, there's different implications, and therefore there's a chakira. Which is it? Is the mitzvah on the oretz, or is the mitzvah on the person? But again, it's the lavin, vazayin doing them, with the lavin, the prohibitions that are connected to Shvius. For example, Sod Chalei Sizra, you should not plant your field, the Karma Chalei Sizmer, you shouldn't work with your vineyard. Is Pasha does the Isa Leisa says not off in Gavra. It's obvious that the Leisa says on the person. That the person should not do any work in the field. The Leisa is on the person. You can't put a Leisa on a piece of land. But the mitzvah say of Shvisas ha'oretz, is it on the oretz or is it on the person? What's the difference halachically? What is the practical application if you say Shvisas, the mitzvah is on the oretz or on the person? If the mitzvah is that this karka from Eden darf haben Shvisa, if the mitzvah is that the karka belonging to a yid has to rest, cannot have malacha done with it. Is demol kechilik nidveres is sheilol de shvisa und tut the arbit in sein karka. And it doesn't matter who would be negating the rest, who is doing the work. I feel if this is tut a goy, even if a goy, a person who is not obligated in the mitzvah of shmita, works on his field, is the bala karka over after I say the owner will still transgress this mitzvah say of shvisas haaretz because work is being done on his land. But if you're going to say that the prohibition is on the individual person, then if a goy comes in and works his land, there's no problem as long as the person himself is not doing the work. So that's the chakira that we have. Is the mitzvah of shvisas haaretz that the aretz should not have work done, or is the mitzvah on the person that he should not do work? In Sif Beis, we're going to bring another Chakira that is very similar in its nature to this one, and we're going to try later to compare the two. There is another argument or debate with regards to another mitzvah saseh that's related to Shvius. The mitzvah is v'hashvius tishmetena unetashta. The fruits of Shvius, the fruits that are the produce that grows during Shvius, you shall release it and you shall abandon it. In other words, a person is not allowed to do anything with the peiros that grew in Shvius. So the chira is, see the mitzvah for Shmitas HaPeiros is as das was the Erd git arois b'Shvius, darf der Balabayis mashmit mafkir sein. The fruits that grow on Shvius, does the Balabayis, does the owner of the field have to proactively release the fruit, meaning to say, make them hefker, render them ownerless? As the Rambam says, we were commanded to make hefker, to render ownerless anything that grows. Or as the Rambam says in Mishnah Torah, to release, to drop anything that the land produces in Shvius. That's one way. I have a mitzvah, if I'm a field owner, I have a mitzvah to specifically take the fruit or the produce that grows and make it hefker. Another way of looking at it is the Shemitah is in an oifen von Afkaita de Malka. Afkaita de Malka means dispossession by the king. Similar to a law we have here called eminent domain, that the king is able to dispossess someone from their possessions. In this case, the king is the Torah. The Torah takes away the fruit from the ownership of the person. The Torah when the Shvius, when the Balabais stood going to them, and the Balabais does nothing. The Balabais doesn't have to do anything because the Torah does it. The Torah makes the fruit hefker automatically, and therefore the fruit is hefker. The fruit is ownerless, but the Balabais doesn't have to do anything. Now, again, what would be the practical application if you say afkaita de malka, or if you say that the person has a chiyuv, an obligation to make it hefker? There'll be two differences. The second one will be refuted later. But let's do the first one first. But the chiluk of pashtos is in fal. The difference would be in a case when there is a beferish nit mafker, when the person does something to explicitly not make his fruit ownerless. For example, Geider Sadeyu, he puts a fence up around, or he locks the fence around his field. V'noyel karmoi, he locks the vineyard. Now, in the Haaretz he says that if a person does nothing, then it would be hefker anyway, because the Torah says it has to be hefker. So it would become hefker even if he didn't say anything, even though he does have a mitzvah according to this side of the chakira to make it hefker. But what happens if the person, not only did he not do anything, but he said, I am not being mafkirit. I want it, it's mine, I'm keeping it. So if we're waiting for the person to make it hefker, to make it ownerless, is chacher is over after mitzvah say, even though he's transgressing a mitzvah say, which because the Torah commanded him to make it ownerless. But nevertheless, another person can come and take those fruits. And if he does, he would be transgressing the prohibition of stealing, because the fruit still belonged to the person. Because since he said, I'm not being mafkirit, and it's up to him to make it hefker. So you can't take it, you can't take those fruit until he goes and he says, until he goes and says make it hefker, or as he says here in the Sikha, even if he doesn't say anything, it's okay. But if he specifically says I'm not being mafkirit, then it's still his. But if it's being done, if he's being dispossessed by the king, by the Torah, then even if he's screaming and shouting, it's mine, and it goes again, and it's against his will, it's not up to him. The fruit don't belong to him, and the other people can come and take it. There's another nafkamina that is brought, another practical application that is brought to explain the difference between these two approaches in the debate. We know that in the year of Shemitah, the Peiros Shvius are potter from Meiser. which means a person is allowed to take for themselves fruits of Shvius, but they don't have to give Meiser from it. Nor does the owner of the field have to give Meiser. Why? Because the Peiros are Hefker. The Peiros don't belong to him. If we say that the person has to make them Hefker, then as the Peiros Shvius was there is a nit Mafkir, then if the person explicitly is not Mafkir his Peiros, he's keeping them, they're his, then he would have to give Meiser. The whole reason why he's potter from Meiser is because it's Hefker. Then if it's not Hefker, he has to give Meiser. But if you would say that the reason they're Hefker is because the Torah made them Hefker, he's moving as I need Mafker ein entered garnet. So it's understood that his not making it Hefker changes nothing in the status of the fruit. When the Peiros are potter from Meiser, and therefore they're ownerless, and therefore they're potter from Meiser. So another difference that you might suggest is to say whether, well, in a case where a person is not mafkir his fruit, are they chayiv or not meiser? If you say that he has to be mafkir it, and if he wasn't mafkir it, then it's chayiv and meiser. But if you say it's afkai to the malka, then it doesn't matter what he does or what he wants. The fruit are not his, and therefore they're about to meiser. In Sif Gimel, he's going to refute this last differentiation, and he's going to say that it could be that the reason that they're potter from Meiser is not because they're Hefker. They're potter from Meiser because the Torah was potter you from Meiser this year because they're supposed to be Hefker. But once they're supposed to be Hefker, Torah was pottered from Meiser in every case, even in a case when the person wasn't Mafker them. That's what he's going to say. Let's look at it inside, because it's a very, very beautiful refutation. One might suggest that even if someone does not make his fruit hefker, for specifically keeping them, that it's a potter from Meiser, they would still be potter from Meiser, even according to the approach that it's an obligation on the person, and therefore if he wasn't mafkir, it's not hefker. Still, you might suggest that it's still potter from Meiser. Because we could say, Ados was Peiros Shvius, seinen Potter from Meiser is mitam Hefker. The fact that Peiros Shvius are Potter from Meiser because it's Hefker, it does not their farvals is an Hefker bepoil. It does not waiting for it actually to become Hefker in order for the fruits to become Potter from Meiser. Nor mitzadem chiyuv zu sein Mafkir sein. Because there's an obligation to be Mafkir the fruits, therefore the Torah lechatchila did not give you the obligation to give Meiser because the Torah is expecting you to be Mafkir it. And it cannot be yours. And he's going to explain this. The Asbari in them. Let's explain what does this mean. What does this mean? What's the difference whether you say that it's potter from Meiser because it's Hefker, or it's potter from Meiser because it has to be Hefker, it's supposed to be Hefker. So he says like this: Al derech in der Friedeke 6 Jahr is da achilek in Mchiyah from the Meiser. In the first 6 years of the 7-year cycle, there's a difference in which years you're obligated in which Meiser. In the first and second year, and in the fourth and the fifth year, is when mafresh meiser sheni after truma and after meiser rishon. You are also mafresh meiser sheni. Also separate meiser sheni, a second tithe, which is then taken to Yerushalayim and eaten by the owner in Yerushalayim. Und shlishis v'shishis, and in the third year and the 6th year of the 7-year cycle, is ben anstot meiser sheni mafresh meiser ani. Instead of the meiser sheni, we give meiser ani, we tithe and give it to the poor. What's the What's the reason that the Torah didn't say to do all 3 in 1 year? But there's meiser rishon, meiser sheni, meiser ani. Why are we alternating with meiser sheni, meiser ani? B'chdem is only darfen geben in your ala meisers. It's too much. It's a lot on a person to have to give Meiser Rishon, then Meiser Sheni, and Meiser Oni. So the Torah says, okay, we'll alternate. Some years you'll give Meiser Sheni, some years you'll give Meiser Oni. So if the whole reason why we have to give Meisers in different years is because Torah is trying to give us a break, what happens if a person doesn't give Meiser Sheni 1 year? Does he have to replace it with Meiser Ani? Do you have to say, when you're giving Meiser Sheni, you don't have to give Meiser Ani? But if you're not giving Meiser Sheni, then you should give Meiser Ani. So he says, no. So they give Meiser Ani. We don't find anywhere, any source in Torah or in Poskim that say that if a person didn't give Meiser Sheni one year, when he's supposed to, he has to give Meiser Ani instead. V'hatam. Once the Torah established the schedule that in year 1 and 2 you give Meiser Sheni and not Meiser Ani, then the Tvua of that year has no obligation of Meiser Ani. It's not like Meiser becomes, you have to give Meiser all the time. And, if you don't give this, then you can give this. It doesn't work like that. Once the Torah established a schedule, then Meiser Ani is given in year 3 and in year 6, and year 1, 2, 4, and 5, there's no chiyuv for Meiser Ani, even if he didn't give Meiser Sheni. So let's use the same reasoning and apply it to the fruit that grow in the year of Shvius. Since Torah obligated us to make the fruit and produce of this year hefker, so therefore the Torah says there's no obligation for meiser this year, because this year you're supposed to do something else with it. This year you're supposed to render the entire thing ownerless, and therefore I did not obligate you in meiseris. Even if you didn't fulfill what you were supposed to do, like the person who didn't give Meiser Sheni, he still doesn't change the fact that year 1 and 2 there's no chiyuv of Meiser Ani. Year 4 and 5 there's no chiyuv of Meiser Ani. Year 7 there's no chiyuv of Meiser at all, even when the person didn't actually make them hefker. So that refutes the second application, the second nafkamina, but it still retains the first one, and we still have a chakira. Are the fruits that are grown during Shvius, are they hefker because the person makes them hefker, or are they hefker because of Afkaita de Malka, the Torah makes them hefker, and they become automatically hefker regardless of what the person does and says? So in Sif Dalet, we're going to try to resolve this chakira by bringing in a medrash about Shvius. We can bring a proof as the hefker from Shvius is Afkaita de Malka, that it works as Afkaita de Malka, as something that the Torah does from Loshna Medrash, from the words of the Medrash. The pasuk in Tillim, the strong people of great strength, who fulfill his word, who listen to what he says the Medrash. This is referring to, who are these Gibayrim, these heroes, these strong people? This is referring to the people who observe Shvius. Why are they called strong? Because he sees his field is ownerless. He sees his trees ownerless. And he sees the fences broken open. He sees his fruit being eaten. Nevertheless, he controls his Yetzirah. The Einim Medaber doesn't speak out, doesn't stop it. So this is a person of great strength. That's what the Medrash says. Now let's look at the wording of the Medrash. He sees, he's watching as his field is hefker and his trees are mufkarim. He's mashma as if it hefker for zichalei. It's mashma that it's becoming hefker by itself. Because the Torah was mafkirit, doesn't say hifkir sadeyu behifkir ilanoisa that he was mafkirit. He says he's looking out the window and he sees how his field is hefker. He sees how his trees are hefker, ownerless. It seems to imply that it happened by itself without him. So l'chayre, from the words of the Medrash, the way the Medrash says, it seems to imply that how did it happen? It happened through Afkaita de Malka. However, in the next paragraph, he's going to refute this. And he's going to say, truth be told, you might be able to taich ein, difficultly, but at least somewhat, in the words of the Medrash, that the Medrash is talking about the facts on the ground, not how it happened. So in other words, it's possible that it happened because he made it hefker, but by the time it comes to actual shmita and he sees what's going on, he wants to scream and shout and he doesn't. So he's called a gibayre koyach. As the Medrash is metared the matzah from the Masad of Ilam is the Medrash is describing the state of the field in reality, in real life. Sadeu mufkeres, the field is hefker. In Ilanesav mufkarim, the trees are hefker. Nidreiten dig wegen dem Sibe davon. And the Medrash is not addressing the cause, how it became hefker. But if the Medrash out, it's possible that even the Medrash holds, as is an Givar and hefker, nor durch them was the mentioned him hefker, and they became hefker only because the person made them hefker. And why does the Medrash focus on the roya and seeing it? So what's the big deal? He himself did it. So why all of a sudden now is he so frustrated and he has to control his yetzer? Now he sees it happening. Now it's hard. To say, oh, it's hefker, it might be easier. But then to go and look out the window and see people strolling through his field, taking his stuff, that's very difficult. So Lav Dafka, the Medrash, is taking sides in this debate. Could be the Medrash is just saying that when it actually happens and he sees the situation on the ground, this frightens him. This, and not frightens him, upsets him. And nevertheless, he says nothing. This is because it's a Gibayre Koyach. But we can't deduce from here necessarily that the Medrash is taking a side in the Chakira, whether it's Afkaita de Malka or whether it's the Balabayis that has to make it Hefker. So we're back to our Chakira. We do not yet have a resolution. We're still wondering, is the Shmitas Karkoi, Shmitas Peiris, in the year of Shemitah, is it become hefker because the balabais makes it hefker, or does it become hefker because of afkaita de malka, because the Torah dispossesses him of this produce? In Sif Hey, we're going to try to answer the question by comparing Shmitas Karkois, Shmitas Peiris, which is in this context going to be seen as the same thing, and Shmitas Ksafim, another mitzvah with regards to the year of Shemitah, which is the fact that if a person is owed money, then when it comes the year of Shemitah, there's Shmitas Ksafim, the loan becomes cancelled. We'll discuss what cancelled means. But the loan becomes cancelled and the borrower does not have to pay it back anymore. And we're going to try to compare the Shmitas Karkois and Shmitas Ksafim. V'yash leimar. We could bring a source and a proof to the day, to the opinion. Shmitas Karkois is nit afkaita the malka nor chevas gavra. The Shemitah of the karka is not afkaita the malka. It's not being accomplished through the Torah, by the Torah, but it's the obligation on the person. From them, was meant for gleich Shmitas Karkois to Shmitas Ksafim. From the fact that in the Gemara, Shmitas Karkois and Shmitas Ksafim are being compared one to the other. And this is the Gemara in Gittin. V'zed vara Shmitah shamoid. The pasuk says this is the matter of Shemitah. This is the halachas of Shemitah. Shamoit, that any creditor has to drop the loan. So the pasuk says, it says Shemitah shamoit. B'shtei Shemitah sekasam medaber. The pasuk is talking about two elements of Shemitah. Acha Shmitas karka. One is the Shemitah of karka. V'acha Shmitas ksafim. And what is Shmitas ksafim? Bizman sha'at meshamet karka. When there is Shmitas karkois, then Shmitas ksafim applies. This Gemara, just to give you a little clarity, is talking about the idea of pruzbul. That Hillel was mesakin pruzbul. So the Gemara asks a question. How could Hillel take something the Torah says that you don't have to pay back the loans, and Hillel made a tikkun of a pruzbul where you do have to pay back the loans? So the Gemara answers that Hillel is following the opinion of Rabbi. That Rabbi holds that Shmitas Ksafim does not apply Bisman Hazeh. It only applies during the Bisman Shah Yovel Noyig, during the time of the Yovel, when the Beis Mikdash was standing, and then during Shemitah, Shmitas Karkois was applicable, and therefore also Shmitas Ksafim was applicable. But in the time where Yovel is not Noyig, and therefore Shmitas Karkois are not in effect, also Shmitas Ksafim is not in effect. That's Midei. Then came the Chachamim and they said we should still keep Shmitas Ksafim even Bisman Hazeh. Came Hillel and said if it's only a Takanas Chachamim, then we can make a Takanas Chachamim of Pruzbul to that your person should still pay back the loans because Bezdin is taking control of the loan. So what we see from here is that the Torah compares Shmitas Karkois to Shmitas Ksafim, that they're dependent one on another. When Agama does his nor das Rebbe and das Rabbanon, and even though this is a one opinion, the opinion of Rebbe, not Rabbanon, is aber sehr plukte nor of them was Rebbe sagt was man shatam samet karka. The argument of Rabbanon over Rebbe is that Rabbanon argue when they say that even bisman hazeh Shmitas Ksafim is noyeg. It's not something that was just bisman of Shmitas Karka. So they're arguing over the outcome. Aber nicht auf dem Zugleichen, that's what the Karka, that's what the Ksafim. But even the Rabbanan will agree that you can compare in other things Shmitas Karka and Shmitas Ksafim. Because it says V'zedvar HaShmitas Shamit, it says 2 times the word Shmita, and one is for Shmitas Karka, one is for Shmitas Ksafim. So there is a comparison between the two. Even the Rabbanan will agree to that. And therefore, we're going to now compare Shmitas Karka and Shmitas Ksafim. In order to do that, we have to first explore the halacha of Shmitas Ksafim. By Shmitas Ksafim sagt die Mishnah, in Masechta Shvius, Amach zechayiv b'Shvius. The Mishnah says like this, and this is the second to last Mishnah of Mishnayos Masechta Shvius, and this is the beginning of Siyum Masechta Shvius. Amach zechayiv b'Shvius nachim zman hashmita. In other words, b'Shvius over here doesn't mean in the year of Shemitah, it means in the time when Shvius is noyeg, because the chayiv debts become cancelled at the end of the Shemitah year. So if a person comes to repay a loan after the year of Shemitah, the lender should say, Mishamet ani, I have released the loan, I've dropped the loan, you don't owe me anymore. If the borrower said, nevertheless, I still want to pay, Yakabel mimenu, he should accept the money. Shenemar v'zed dvar hashmita. From the fact that it says the word dvar doesn't just mean the matter of the Shemitah, but it also could mean the word daber, to speak. That Shemitah is something that has to be said. He has to say, Mishamet ani. Now, Shemitah is afkaita de malka, Now let's apply the previous chakira to here. Is the fact that the person has to say Mishamet ani, is that the main part? Or is it afkaita de malka, that the Torah takes away the loans? So he says like this, if Shemitah was afkaita de malka, then we would have 3 problems with the words of the Mishnah. Number 1 is nidglat lashna Mishnah hamachzir chayv. First of all, it's calling it a chayv, a debt. In this case, if the leiva is repaying it, if the Torah canceled the loan, then the leiva can give him a gift, a thank you gift, but it's not a chayv. Then there's a lashon mishamet ani. I am releasing the loan, not me being the lender. It's not the lender; it's the Torah. Pirush HaMefarshim from them Pirush HaMefarshim from them Leiva Zagan Afal Pikain. And then when the Leiva says Afal Pikain, the Mefarshim explain as er will lifroya dem chayv, he wants to repay the debt. What debt is he repaying? There's no debt. Nochmer. Additionally, if Torah says, if it's afkaita de malka, Torah says that come Shvius, the leiv ceases to exist, the debt is gone. It should be against the law for the leiv to go to do something that's against the Torah. Torah says there's no loan. The leiv says I want to pay the loan. To get in the geld to pay it back as a debt. Und die Mishnah sagt gar, as nit nor megmed das leveton. The Mishnah, and this is the next Mishnah, which is the last Mishnah of Shvius. The Mishnah says that someone who repays a loan in Shvius, not only is he allowed to do this, if he says Afal Pikain, nor in the next Mishnah, Ruach Chachamim Neichem Imenu, wie steht in the zweite Mishnah, that the Chachamim are pleased with this. How could they be pleased if it was something that's being done against the afkaita de malka of Torah, which Torah canceled the loan? It's mashma from the malim, so from the fact that it says mishamet ani, and the fact that it says chamach zir choiv, and the fact that we see that the leiva is allowed to, the borrower is allowed to repay the loan. So from this we learn Shmitas is neat in gather from afkaita de malka. It's not that it was canceled by the Torah. As the chayvet legamri nifkev in his battle b'derech hamela, that the loan is totally and entirely removed or uprooted by the Torah. Nor there's 2 things here. If you notice, the word legamri is highlighted because really there's 2 outcomes from this fact that it's not of kaita de malka. If it was of kaita de malka, then first of all, he wouldn't probably wouldn't be allowed to pay it. And even if he was, even if he paid it, it would be a gift. Why? Because the chayv would be legamri. It would be entirely cancelled. But here we're saying, no, number one, there is an obligation on the person, on the malva, to release the loan. Beis, as der geder achiyuv is nitzu mafkia umevatel zayin dem chayv legamri. That which he says meshametani, he's not entirely canceling the loan. Nor lost up meshamet dem chayv, he releases the loan. Montim nit, he can't demand it. Lo yigois, he cannot demand it from the person. Alpiza. Now that we says there's a chayvas gavra, very verstandig was the Rambam sagt mitzvah say lahashmit hamilve. B'shvis, here the word is not hamalve. Here the word is hamilve, the loan. It's a mitzvah to say to release the loan b'shvis and shmita shenemar v'chulu. So was bepashtos is doch shaykh when der mashmit sein is achiv even malve und nicht wenn safkeit the malka. If you say mitzvah say lahashmit, the mitzvah on the person to be mashmit, to release the loan, only makes sense if it's a mitzvah on the person, not if the Torah is doing it for him automatically. So the lashon and now mitzvah say lahashmit makes more sense now. Unloid them, and now going back before the brackets, we said two things. Number one, we said that the chayvas gavra on the malve to be mashmit, to release the loan. Number two, this release does not cancel the loan. It just means that the malve, the lender, is not going to demand it from the loive, from the borrower, but the halva, the loan still exists. It's still out there. Lay them is muzber, but the Rambam zok. This will help us understand what the Rambam says. The malva has to say to the returner, to the person who's returning, who's trying to repay the loan, I'm releasing the loan, and you were exempted from me. Notice that he's calling him a machzir, a returner, because he's returning something that still exists. You're potter from me. If the Levi says, nevertheless, I wanted to accept this, he's allowed to accept it because he fulfilled his obligation. The obligation is do not demand the loan, do not collect it, and he didn't demand it. Thus haste. He's going to explain like this. It's not like there's two separate mitzvahs. A mitzvah say to be mashmit, and a mitzvah leisa say not to collect. Not collecting is the description of the being mashmit. How am I mashmit the chayv? By not collecting it. Das heißt, as the chiyuv mitzvah and malva mashmitani is mugdir in them, but says mekayim dem layigas. It's defined by the fact that he's fulfilling. Do not demand it. It's not a separate prohibition. It's part of the fulfillment of the positive mitzvah of being mashmit, of releasing the loan, is to not collect it. As the lechinuch uses the word lazev, uplosen, leave it alone. That says nitmanen, not demand it. And it's also understood this way from the psukim. Shamoit kol bal mashe yodoy asher yasher b'reyehu. All creditors should release that which they would be claiming from their friend. Lo yigoy says reyehu, he should not collect it, exact it, pull it out from his friend. Ve'as achiv. The goimar, what you have by your brother, tashmet yodecha, your hand should release it. So we see that how do you do the shomit kol bal masha yodei by lo yigos, by not demanding it, by not schlepping it away from him. That is how you fulfill it. Now he's going to continue and to explain this idea that the chayv still exists. It's a very important nekuda because that's how we say a machzer chayv b'shvius. The chayv still exists. The fact that the loiva is allowed to return it and ruach hachavim neichei menu is because we said before that since the whole cancellation of the loan was only mashmitani, only the malva, the lender, dropping it, but in the world the chayv still exists. The money was taken from person A, it was given to person B, and it belongs to person A. The money's in the wrong place. That didn't change. So therefore, like we said before, there's two aspects. There's the aspect of the loiva has to say mashmitani, and that when he does that, he just drops the loan. He doesn't cancel the loan. Since the Layigos obligates and forces the malva, the lender, to drop, to not demand the debt, is moving over there. So the malva, the lender, lost his bond, so to speak, with the loiva because he's not allowed to demand. The loiva therefore loses his bond with the malva. He's not obligated to pay back. He brings in the hardest that certain opinions. If a loiva if the malva doesn't ask for it, even not in the year of shmita, the loiva doesn't have to pay. The loiva pays once the malva asks, because the malva opens up this connection. He says, when he says pay me back, the loiva then pays back. But that's a huge discussion in the hardest. And obviously in the Rishonim and in the Achronim that are referenced in the Haaretz. But the idea is, the relationship of the Malva and the Loiva are interdependent. And therefore, if the Malva can't demand it from the Loiva doesn't have a fiduciary responsibility towards the Malva. I drop the loan, and you're potter from me. Your potter literally means exempt, but you're disengaged from me. As the Leva wird nifter von sein Shibud zum Malva. The Leva becomes potter, exempt from his obligation to the Malva. Aber das ist nur bittel Shibud in dem Yachas von Geder Gavre zwischen Malva und Leva. This only cancels the interpersonal connection between the Malva and the Leva, the connection of the Gavra. Es bleibt aber der Shibud auf die Nichse Leva. The shibud, the obligation on the belongings, on the possessions of the loiva, of the borrower, still exist. Because the chayv itself wasn't cancelled. The debt wasn't cancelled. Just the obligation to pay it became cancelled. In the Haaretz, he gives an example that if the borrower dies and left nechasim, then the malva could collect those nechasim from the Yershim, because he doesn't have a mitzvah of loyigos, because the loiva doesn't exist, but the shibud still remains, and the shibud is on the nechasim, on the possessions that were around when the father was alive, and now the father is dead. The shibud is still there. The obligation of the connection from the possessions is still there. Again, this is a discussion in the Haaretz, and I don't want to get into it, but I'm giving an example of the fact where you see that even though the loiva is not obligated to pay, but the nechasim, the belongings of the loiva, remain meshubed. Und der Fall ist verstandig, and therefore it's understood. Was the das roiva poiskim, according to most of the poiskim, there's only one opposing opinion, which is that of the Yereim. But other than that, all the opinions agree. Is nito can get there the mitzvah and leiva zurückzuzahlen dem chayv zum malva. There's no mitzvah on the leiva to repay the debt. Ich feier dem wie der malva hat gesagt mashmetani. Even before the malva says mashmetani, since it's the year of Shemitah and the malva has an obligation, a mitzvah of lo yigois, therefore the leiva has no bechiyuv to pay back. And nevertheless, he's referred to as repaying the debt. Because even though the leiva is exempt from repaying the loan, is noch als doder chayv, the loan still exists. And it nit nifke geworden. The debt wasn't cancelled. In other words, when the borrower borrowed, is if a tel von seinen nechasim beschum da halva is on a certain amount of his possessions in the value of the loan, there is almost an ownership of the lender on those possessions. That doesn't change in the year of Shemitah. And it's fair to sagen, das ist ein Inyan from Priyas Balchayv Mitzvah. You can't say that it's true that he doesn't owe it to him, but nevertheless it's a mitzvah to pay it back. The andere Forscher lernen in unserer Mishnah, as some Forscher learn Pshat in the Mishnah. Mishnah Varayas Knal das Yachid. We said before, only the Yereim holds that the Leiva has a mitzvah to pay back the debt. So to say Priyas Bal Chayv Mitzvah, was halt as is da Achiyuv von Leben abzugeben dem Chayv zum Malve. Aber hat nicht gesagt, Mishamet ani. So to say that it's Priyas Bal Chayv Mitzvah, it's a Das Yachid. The Eid, Eisa Mitzvah from Priyas Bal Chayv, I feel like the Deas is Nami the Rabbanan is a Achiyuv Mamish. If it's a mitzvah to repay the debt, then it's a chiv, it's an obligation. We need no ruach hacham neichem imenu. It's not just ruach hacham, the hacham are pleased with him. If it's a chiv, if it's a mitzvah, then he has to do it. It's more than just causing pleasure to the chachamim. So since we say ruach hacham neichem imenu, so there's no inyan of priyas bal chayv mitzvah. So what's pshat machzer chayvay? Not that he's doing it because it's priyas bal chayv mitzvah, but that the chayv still exists. How does the chayv still exist? Because even though the malva says meshamet ani, it was not afkaita de malka, so it wasn't cancelled entirely. The malva just drops the loan by not collecting it, by not demanding it, but the loan still exists. The money is still in the wrong place, so to speak, and the nechasim, the possessions of the leiva, are meshubah to the malva. So the way we learn from here comes out is understood that Shmitas Ksafim is not Afkaita de Malka. Shmitas Ksafim is a Chayvas Gavra, and that's why that's how the Mishnah makes sense. That's why it's Ruach Chacham Nechei Menu, that he's repaying it because the Chayv still exists. If it was Afkaita de Malka, the Chayv wouldn't exist in the first place. And therefore, at least with regards to Shmitas Ksafim, we have seemingly a resolution to the Chakira. Now, as we started in this Se'iv to compare Shmitas Karkois to Shmitas Ksafim, let's see if we can now compare the Shmitas Ksafim to Shmitas Karka. Al Piyas Svara Anal, following this Svara in the meaning for Shmitas Ksafim, is Mistaber Azal Derech Zeh, Shmitas Karkois. The same thing could apply to Shmitas Karkois. Shmitas Karkois, so we're referring to the Peiris. But the Zelber Geder for Shmita B'Shana Hashvius is Sai by Karkois and Sai by Ksafim. The same definition, however you define Shmita by Karka, you can by Ksafim, you can define it by Karka. In especially since we said earlier, it says it says 2 times Shmita, 1 for Shmitas Karkois and 1 for Shmitas Ksafim. So we see that the two are being grouped together in the same pasuk because they could be compared. The Rambam brings us up in Sefer HaMitzvahs, but the Mitzvah Sefer Shmitas Ksafim, and as the Rambam says, the Tisefta says that there's 2 Shmitas, Achas Shmitas Karkois, Achas Shmitas Ksafim, 1 is Shmitas Karkois, and 1 is Shmitas Ksafim. So if they're being grouped together, then they can certainly be compared. But Dvar Shmita meant kipshutei. So what does it mean? That Dvar Shmita means literally, Adosva says Mefaris Vaiter in Mitzvah Shmita. Is mitzvah shmita. The word dvar shmita, on the one hand, means literally, this is the matter, this is the discussion, these are the details of shmita. Das heißt, as is a mitzvah zu eufen gavre zu dabern, mafke sein die Feld. And with zed dvar shmita can mean 2 things: dvar, the matter of, and zed dvar, the word of. That how is a person do shmita? Through daber, through speaking, through saying out mishametani, or I'm being mafke this field. So this resolves our second chakira. The second chakira with regards to Vashvius, Tishmeteno, and Natashta. Is it Chayvas Gavra or is it Afkaita de Malka? And once we are able to compare, once we know that we're supposed to compare Shmitas Karkois and Shmitas Ksafim, by Shmitas Ksafim we said it's not Afkaita de Malka, it's Chayvas Gavra. So also by Shmitas Karkois we can also say Chayvas, that it's a Chayvas Gavra and not Afkaita de Malka. The Chilik is nor. There would be one difference. That's why Shmitas Ksafim, Vibaldi Mitzvahs, Shomet Kobal Masha Yadela Yigai says Reyu, Torbles Nit Monin, Bleibt Ashibut Chefze von Uchevkina. That by Shmitas Ksafim, because the mitzvah is not to cancel the debt, but to drop the debt, to not collect it, not demand it better. So therefore we see from this that, like we said, explained at length in the previous seif, that the chayv still exists. You can't collect, you can't demand it, but it still exists. Or by Shmitas Karka, was dort steht Vashvius Tishmetena unetashta. You should release it and abandon it. You should leave it. You should leave go of it entirely. Then the Peiros unitvu hefker legamri, they become totally hefker, totally ownerless, and the person has no connection to it whatsoever. So there is a difference between karka and ksafim. Now ksafim, the loan still exists, and by karka, there's absolutely no connection from the owner to the produce or to the fruit. But in how it happens, we can totally compare karka and ksafim. And l'cheira, according to this, it doesn't say it clearly in the Sikha, but l'cheira, according to this, we can say that the same thing would apply to the original chakira that we mentioned in the first one of the Sikha. Is it a chiyuv on the oretz, or is it a chiyuv on the person? L'cheira, it's a chayvas gavra. Now, if it's not afkaita the malka, then the chayvas gavra. Even though in my mind I can entertain reasons that you could still say that it's a mitzvah is on shvisas haaretz and not on the person, but l'cheira, from the fact that the Rebbe compares the first chakira to the second chakira, then if in the second chakira we're saying that it's chayvas gavra, then l'cheira also in the first one we could say that it's chayvas gavra, that the chiyuv is on the person lishbois and not so much on the haaretz shetishbeis haaretz. So this resolves the discussion that we had, the first half of the two chakiris that we had with regards to shmitas karkois, and we compared it to shmitas ksafim, and we said that it is a chayvas gavra to say mafkirani, to say mishametani, and that's how it happens, and it's not afkaita the malka, it's not something that happens automatically through the power of Torah. Now we're going to continue, now that we understand this unique element of hashmatas ksafim, that on the one hand the person is being mashmit the chayv, but on the other hand the chayv still exists. We'll now understand the Mishnah and the rest of the Mishnah till the end of Masechta Shvius. Pianal in the minyan hashmatas ksafim. Und der Asbara von der Machzer chayv Shvius rocham nechem imenu. We can use this to also understand the continuation of the Mishnah at the end of Shvius. There's the three stanzas in this last Mishnah. The first is a machzor chayv b'shvius ruach hachav neichei meno, that if a person repays his debt, the chachamim are pleased. Then it says alevim in ager shenis gairu bon of imei, someone who borrows money from a ger whose children became gedim with him. And you say they weren't born after he was already a ger, which then they're considered his children halachically, but they were born before he became a ger, so halachically they're not considered his children with regards to Yerusha or stuff like that. So lo yachzil abanov. So then if the ger passed away, then he does not have to return the chayv to his children, because a ger that is considered as someone who has no relatives, and therefore, again, referring to children that were born before he became a ger, he doesn't have to repay the chayv. But if he does repay the debt, meaning say he paid it off to the children, ruach chachamim neichem imenu, chachamim are pleased with him. Then there's a third stanza of the Mishnah. If a person is acquiring metaltlin, movable objects, though even if he paid for it, it's still not considered a kinyan. It's still not considered that it was transferred to his ownership, to his possession, until he does meshicha, until he pulls it towards him. Which means to say that if a person does a verbal business deal, says, I'm going to sell you this, I'm going to buy this, sell this to you, or buy this from you, etc., then there's no kinyan, and there's no obligation one to the other. But a person who fulfills his word, who fulfills his verbal obligation, even though he's not obligated to do so, chacham are pleased with him. So, the shaykhis, when they say, the connection between the two later stanzas to the first is not nor in them was in the alle drei is ruach chacham neichem imenu. It's not just because these are three things that the chachamim are pleased with a person who's doing something that he's not obligated to do and does it anyways, and this causes pleasure to the chachamim. They're also similar in the reason why the chachamim are pleased with him. Is nitakin chiyuv v'shibud gavra to batzal dem chayiv. Nor blaze hashibud chafza. Just like by the shvius, there's no obligation from person to person to repay the debt, like we said before at length. There's only a shibud of the chefza. The loan was unpaid, and it is the possessions of the loiva that are mishubad, that are owned or connected to the bound to the malva. That's why there's no obligation for him to pay. It's only something that pleases the chachamim. As nitokin shibud gavre von dem Leive zu die Bonne von Ger. There's no shibud. The borrower from a person who borrowed from the ger, he's not meshubah to the ger because the ger is dead. He's not meshubah to the children of the ger because they're not related. Nor is there any obligation from the meicher to the lekeach because there was no kinyan. Nor blaze shibud chefza. What remains? What remains is the fact that money was borrowed and wasn't paid back, and that an agreement was made that isn't being kept. So that's only a shibud of the chefza. The people are not players here. Only the event that occurred is still there. And therefore, also by these two things, it's not something that there's a chiyuv. It's just a ruach hacham. We're going to explain soon why. Why do chacham care? If the children of the ger are not related and there's no one to pay to, why do chacham even have pleasure from this? That we'll get to in a moment. But first, we're establishing the fact that there's a comparison in all three cases where the two people involved are not involved anymore with each other for various reasons, for respective reasons. But nevertheless, there is still a chefza. There's still an event or an object. It's not really an object. There's still something that happened here that remains bound to the situation, and then when that is resolved, but now we have to take this to the next level. Not only is this a case of shibud, are they all three cases of shibud chefza and not shibud gavre? And therefore, late in Klalas, they say that above is in Mishnah. According to the rule that when there is a series of cases in a Mishnah, they're organized in not just this, but also this, which means to say that the second one and then the third one will always be a greater chiddush than the one preceding it. Darf man sagen, as die drei Fallen in der Mishnah seinen ausgestellt as in jeder weite dicke Bove is da chiddush in dem Inyan von Rocham Necham Imenu legabe der friedike Bove. Then it must be that also in this Mishnah, these three cases are organized in a way that each new case is a greater chiddush than the one before it. And we have to explain that. Why is the case of the ger a greater chiddush than a machzechayv b'shvius? And why is kol metaltel kol makayim dvarei a greater chiddush than the levim and ger? So we first have to ask a couple of questions in the Mishnah. In the zweite Bava, so libas after Mishnah sagen leyachs lebanov. Then it steht nor a levim and ger is gairu banav imay im hechs lebanov rocham nechemanu. Had it just said the words that if someone borrows from a ger, if he repays it to the children, the Chachamim are pleased. Without saying he's not obligated to return it to the children. But when first time talking chiyuv, we would have understood that it's not an obligation. Why did it have to say out in the dritter bava? Now when you come to the third case, so the first thing he says is that anything that's a movable object is acquired through moving it, through pulling it. And anybody who fulfills his verbal promise. This also pleases the Chachamim. Move on. The Mefarshim asks this question. The Mishnah is the goal of the Mishnah is to express the greatness of someone who fulfills his word. Because this is not the place to discuss transactions. Dinim of Kinyan is not here. There's other places where other Mishnayos where they discuss the dinim of Kinyan. Only the Chisa. And Chol Makayim is Dvaroi is not just by acquiring metaltalin. Anytime a person fulfills his word, the person says, I'll see you in Shul tomorrow, and you fulfill your word. Is my So how does this introduction, that metaltalin is acquired through Mashiach, how is that introduction, how does it belong here? How does it fit in here? So now we'll understand. So now to explain this, we have to understand this. We want to explain the Mishnah. The basic meaning, the simple meaning is as das was Chachamim oyavim eisei al zeh. The Yashar beinei masha asa. Chachamim like him for what he did, and it is upright in their eyes what he accomplished. Is nit nor machmas dem was is dome kaima zaytike mitzvah. It's not just because there is a ulterior a side thing being fulfilled, or there is nit over, or he's not transgressing a side thing. Like, for example, we're going to see by the ger that we're afraid that if the person doesn't repay the loan to the children are going to leave Yiddishkeit. They're going to say a religion that causes us to lose our father's money, we want to be part of it. So if you're repaying the loan in that case, it's not because the loan has to be repaid, it's because we don't want to lose the children. So, but if Chacham say it must mean that it's not because of an outside of an outer benefit. Nor zu lieb dem, was bringt mit teuf in der Sach was getan. Ruach HaMenechem, and it means that he's accomplishing something positive within this very situation. So let's apply that to this case of the loan in Shvius. Ruach HaMenechem is to leave sein tana gute Sache. It's because he's doing something good. Hagamen is the dinit b'chuyev, although he's not obligated to do so. The advantage of his actions affects the very loan. It's not that there's an outside result, because then people will continue to lend money or other outside gains. The very loan itself is gaining from this repayment, which is why Ruacham Nechemanu. And to explain what do we mean by this? What does it mean that the loan itself is gaining? So it says like this: when you have a loan, or for that matter, a transaction, is made up of three components: the malve, beis loive, and gimel de geld. You have a malve, a lender; you have a loive, a borrower. Then you have the money that creates a connection between the borrower and the lender. So there's three components here. When a person repays a loan that seemingly was cancelled because of Shvius, is the Ruach Chachamim Nechamenu V'Shaychus to the Aladai. The Chachamim are pleased with regards to all three components of this loan. The Malva versus Mekabel Don Chayv. Number one, they're happy about the Malva. Since he did a mitzvah, he lent money. Is Ruach Chachamim Necha. The Ruach Chachamim is happy from them was to Chachzeras Achayv vert Bavarint as the Malva soll durch sein Pulas an Mitzvah nit leiden kein Geld schaden. The Chachamim are pleased that the Malva should not have any financial losses because of his mitzvah. He did a mitzvah of lending money. If the guy doesn't pay back, the Malva loses money. So the Chachamim are happy that the Malva has no financial loss. But again, them leiva. Vibal does their Malva is bitter the shasas midday. The Malva did him the Malva is like a well from which he drank. Meaning to say, he did him a favor. Is Ruach Necha von dem was the Leva the Meregesh Leva from the Malva. The Ruach are pleased that the Leva has the decency, has the proper feelings, the decency to repay. He did you a favor, pay him back, even if you're not obligated to do so. This is in addition to the benefit for the Leva himself, that if the Leva ever needs to borrow again, he'll be able to go back to him. If the Leva didn't repay his loan, even though he wasn't obligated to do so, he's going to have a hard time borrowing again from this person. So we have the benefit for the Malva, that he didn't lose any money, but the benefit for the Leva, that he's a mensch, that he's repaying his loan, and that he can, if he has to, borrow again. There's also the third component, the loan itself. Since there was a obligation that remained, even though the Leva doesn't have, as a person, doesn't have an obligation, but the money has an obligation. To use other words that are not really in the Sikha, but just to explain this concept, everything has to fall into place. It says in the Gemara, Bas Pleni Lepleni, Sada Pleni Lepleni, things belong in certain places. When the Malva lent the money to the Leva, the money really belongs to the Malva. The Leva now doesn't have to give it back, the Malva can't collect it, but the money is in the wrong place. The money is not where it should be. So what happens is, when a person repays his loan, then the money goes to the right place. It inherently belongs to the Malva. It belongs in the possession of the Malva. And therefore, as long as he doesn't pay the Chayv, not only is the Malva and the Leva losing out, but the money is in the wrong place. This Shibud is unfinished. And therefore, when the money ends up in the right place, Ruach Chachamim Neichem Imenu, this pleases the Chachamim. So that's the first part of the Mishnah, that Amach Zechayv B'Shvius there's a benefit to the malva, there's a benefit to the loiva, there's a benefit to the loan itself, and in all three details. Siftes in dem zweiten Fall leben in a gershon is guided banov, which says that if the person borrows from a ger, he does not have to return it to the children. And if he did, the chachamim are pleased. It's not just like we said before, not just for side reasons, as only that the children should not return to their previous ways. Also here, there is a gain with regards to the loan itself. There's a benefit with regard to the loan itself. Here we don't have three components, we only have two components. Der Loive und die Chefze von Chayv. The Malva is dead. The Malva is gone. And the Yorshim, he doesn't have Yorshim. The Banav are not Yorshim. So there is no lender here. So we have a borrower and we have the debt. So there's two components. Since the Leva received a benefit, a favor from the Ger, and borrowed money with the intent of repaying, even though minadin he doesn't have to pay because the ger passed away. He so there is an obligation to him. It's not an obligation, but the chayv, there's still some level of decency that he should give it back. His plan was to return it, so he should return it. Also, if you look at it from the perspective of the debt itself, there's no lender to whom to repay the debt. But the shibud, the obligation on the possessions of the loiva in the value of the loan. It's as if it doesn't belong to the loiva. Like we said before, there's me'ein of a bailus. There's almost an ownership to the malva on it, which means the loiva is lacking some level of ownership. My batle. What canceled that? The fact that there's still a shibud from the nichsei haloiva, from the borrower's possessions. We don't know to who it is yet, because the malva is not here anymore, and he doesn't have any relatives. But that shibud still exists. Nothing cancelled out that shibud. So from the perspective of the loiva who committed to pay, and for the perspective of the loan which wasn't repaid, there is unfinished business here. The question is to whom to pay. The only people that have some sort of connection here are the children. So the yachzru l'sudam, so that way they shouldn't leave and go back to their wayward ways. Is yachzru l'banov, the only people to return it to is the children. Not because it's owed to them, but because they're the closest thing to someone that has connection to the money. Und der Fall is therefore the Chacham are pleased that the two elements, the two components, the loiva and the loiva is doing what he's supposed to. The debt is going to where it's supposed to, and those two details. But here there's no ruach chom with regards to the malva. You can't say any benefit is going to the malva. Well, mesa malva their ger, because the ger who was the lender died. Together from malva, the children don't inherit the definition of malva. They're not called lenders. We're giving it to them because they're the closest thing to the money. But they're not lenders, so there is no lender here. So you can't say Ruach Chav Nechem with regards to the malva, because there is no malva. So we say Ruach Chav Nechem with regards to the loiva, with regards to the loan. When the Mishnah this answers the question why the Mishnah says Chachas is moving from them as hechzir is naruach chacham nechan, even though it's self-understood. If you did repay it, then the chacham are pleased. Obviously means that he's not obligated to do so. So the reason why the Mishnah says it is bichdei to madgish sein as their loive mit bonov of the hot kishaychesnit, to emphasize the fact that the borrower and the children of the lender have no connection. There's no shibud gavra. In the words of the earlier in the Sikha, there's only a shibud chevtze from the loan, but there's no shibud gavra between the loiva, the borrower, and the children of the lender. Nit nor midina, nit weil sie seine nit begeder malve und der loiva hat zu seken shibud nit. Der eigne mit am no chachamim. Not only min adin that they're not considered lenders, and therefore the leiva has no shibud to them. But even mitzad ruach chachamim, there is no connection between the two. The only reason why they're returning it is because of the leiva, or because of the chefza of the loan, not because of the malva. And therefore he says le'achzeh lebanov. There's no shibud to the malva. There's a shibud of the nechasim, but not to the malva. There's no shibud gavra, only shibud chefza. Now, please, this verstandig der chiddush in the zweiten Fall, lev ben ager. Now we understand the chiddush of the second case of the Mishnah, the person who borrowed from the ger, the gabe dem ersten Fall, hamach zechei b'shvius, in comparison to the first case, b'derech leizu avzu. The in for ruach cham lechem and is nicht nur when the teuf und sein meise is in alle drei pratim. The advantage of what he's doing is not just the Chachamim are pleased not only when the good of his action affects all three components, by a machzechayv v'shvius, like by the returning the loan on shvius, where there's a loiva, there's a malva, and there's a chayv. Even if the goodness of his act is only affecting the two components, the loiva and the chefza, even there, ruach cham nechem, and it's a bigger chiddush. Leizu, avzu, not only in the case of three benefits, even if it's only a case of two benefits, Chachamim are still pleased that the loan is being repaid. Now let's go to the third and final case in the Mishnah. Sif Yud. The fact that Chachamim are pleased is not only for a side reason, because the person is being honest, because the person is fulfilling his words. Also, we're talking about the person that's trying to acquire metaltalin. Also, mitzad this chefza, the Chachamim are pleased that the right thing is being done. But the other two components, the buyer and the seller, here it's not a loan, it's a transaction. So there's a buyer and a seller, not a lender and a borrower. But the two people here are not. There's no benefit to them here. In other words, the Chachamim are not pleased with regards to the Meicher and to the Lekeach, as we'll see in a moment. They don't matter here, so to speak. The Chachamim are pleased with regards to the Chefza, which in this case is the Metaltalin. Since the Lekeach, the buyer, did not move the object, did not make a kinyan, even if he paid for it, but he didn't make a kinyan, is done nitakin shibut v'mecher and Lekeach v'kena. There's no bond between the buyer and the seller. There's nothing al pi Torah, al pi halacha. Halacha did not create any bond between the buyer and the seller. When a person makes a kinyan, the kinyan is what halachically creates the transaction. So if it could be a kinyan agav, it could be a kinyan meshicha, it could be a kinyan suder. A kinyan suder is a kinyan agav. Whatever kinyan it is, it could be a kinyan. But if there's no kinyan, then there's no connection between the two. As is Lolverin Ashayches is Nitzei al Smecha v'Kenim Mitzad Gedel HaKinyanim. Nochmer, durch Mekayim Dvoroi, if a person fulfills his word, they're not gaining anything. As felt garnered by the Lekeach, it doesn't lose anything. In our fathers, the Lekeach giving geld, if the Lekeach hasn't paid yet, then he didn't spend anything. If he did spend, he's going to get paid back if they don't follow through. So the Meicher for sure doesn't lose or gain anything. He still has his thing. He still has his object. So if he's Mekayim Dvoroi, the Meicher, the Lekeach, they don't gain anything. There's no toiva that's being done to them, for them. The Metaltalin of haben Bakumen HaShayches, as his blows ein Inyan b'Shayches to Prat v'Chefza. But with regards to the Chefza, something happens here. The Metaltalin of Bakumen HaShayches keine in und durch dem Dibur von Meicher, oder ich mit dem Nesines Dame von Lekeach. When the Meicher says, I'm going to sell this to you, then even though he has no shibud to the gavra of the buyer, but the chefza has a shibud. The Meicher created a shibud in the chefza by saying, I'm going to sell this to you. Und auf dem sagt die Mishnah, als euch in dem Fall, wenn es ist da nor a toiv, mitzad einem von die drei pratim, is euch ruach am nechemenu. So here it says like a bigger chiddush. Not only is it a benefit in three components, not only is it a benefit in two components, here's only a benefit in one component. Only the chefza. The person said, I'm going to give this to you. So now the chefza has a shibud to the lekeach, that's all. Nevertheless, even though there's only one component of a shibud, if the person's mekayim is dvarei, then ruacham nechemenu. And the chayda, this answers the question why it says kol metaltalin niknin b'meshicha, because he's not talking about stam kol mekayim dvarei. I'll see you in shul tomorrow. We're talking about a metaltalin where there's a chefza, and the chefza became a shubed to the lekeach through the dibur of the moiche. So we want to tell you that even though there was no kinyan and there's no shibud gavra, there still is a shibud chefza, and because of the shibud chefza, ruach hachamim nechei menu if he's mekayim es dvarei. Finally, in Sif Yud Aleph, we're going to go a little bit into the Chassidus shebedavar of the Sinyan of Shemitah. Yud Aleph. In the minyan for Shemitah's Ksaf Menal Yifim Ben Adavar Veifuches, now when we go back to Shemitah's Ksaf, we find two incongruous ideas. We find that it's a negative thing. Do not demand the loan. It's in the negative. And therefore, if somebody repays the chayiv, it's still Chacham are pleased with this because it's not a mitzvah asay where the loan is cancelled. It's a leis asay. Do not collect it. Do not demand it. But if a person pays, Chacham are happy. So the all these are in the negative, as the Eretz will nicht bearbeitet werden. We find with regards to the mitzvahs of Shemitah, we find that it's a negative. You're not allowed to demand the loan back. You're not allowed to work the land, etc., etc. Liidach darf auch die Schlille von Shemitah Gufe ausgedrückt werden in einer Efen Chiyuv Yupule in Dibur. On the other hand, there has to be a positive element here, that the person has to actually say it out with his words. The person has to say the words b'shamet ani, because it says the word dvar, which we said earlier, also means to talk. But the kamadeh is the dibur mishamet ani a mitzvah midiraisa, which according to some opinions, there is a mitzvah midiraisa to say mishamet ani. The words. So even though we're saying that on the one hand, it's a negative mitzvah, do not do this, do not do this, nevertheless, it expresses itself in a positive action of speaking. The second half of this Mishnah, which is the second to last Mishnah, says that was exiled to a Ir Miklat, a city of refuge. And the people of the city wanted to give him a kavod, give him an honor. And he should say, don't honor me, I'm a Ritzeach. If they said, we know who you are, we know what you did, and we still want to honor you, you should accept it. He says, the Ritzeach has to say words, dvar, he has to say the words, I'm a Ritzeach. This is a warning that we should not accidentally give him kavod. Similarly, if a person is being honored for finishing two mesechtes, and in truth he only knows one mesechta, he has a mitzvah to say out, I only know one mesechta. They should not give him honor that he doesn't deserve unless they want to, but they have to know where he stands. So we see again that there's a positive element here, a positive meaning a positive act that has to be done of proclaiming the truth. How do you explain this? Whether on the one hand it's a mitzvah of heder and shlila, don't do this, and on the other hand it has to be expressed in dibur. The explanation like this: Shnas Hashvius is Yonas Sfiras HaMalchus. The year of Shemitah is the idea of Malchus. You have 7 Sfiras. Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Yesod, Malchus. Each year of the Shemitah of the 7-year cycle is another Sfira, and Shvius, which is Shabbos La Hashem, is Malchus. When in ears are in the Beidin Yon, Malchus contains 2 components. They're bitul from Sfiras HaMalchus, Legabe the Sfiras Shalamayim Mimeno. On the one hand, Malchus is the end of the level above it, it's the last level, and therefore it's in a state of bittul to all of the levels above it, because they are above it. The other aspect of Malchus, Sfiras Malchus, is Elam HaDibur. Sfiras Malchus is also the world of Dibur, meaning to say it's the Gilur to the next level. It expresses that, let's say, Malchus, the Atzilus, becomes Keser of Bria. Malchus Atzilus gives birth, so to speak, to Eilam Abriya. So on the one hand, it's the end, the lowest, and therefore it's totally bottle to all the dargis of Atzilus above it. On the other hand, it is what expresses Atzilus to the next level, Eilam Adibur. And therefore Shvita has these two components. Vishav Sa'adas, they're bittul and Shvisa in Eretz. The idea that you're not allowed to do anything. You have to cease doing work, which that's the idea of Malchus. So too with regards to the kesef, that the loans get cancelled, there is a bittul, a cancellation of everything. Und zusammen der mit is da a mitzvah b'dibur dvar hashmita. And together with that, there's also a mitzvah to speak out and say mishametani. So this explains why Shemitah has two components, because Shemitah is Malchus, and Malchus also has two components. It is the lowest level of Atzilus, and it is the Gilui into Biyah. Alpise ist verstandig der Medrash Anal, Ashayim Shvius werden angerufen, Oisei Dvoroi, Lishmoya bekel Dvoroi. This also explains why the Medrash uses the word Oisei Dvoroi. Lishmoya bekel Dvoroi, which is the words of the pasuk, doing his word, listening to his word. Nit kolosh naragel bekegein da Oisei mitzveisav, Oisei chokaisav bekayetze bezeh. Weil inyan hashmita is verbunden b'miyuchat mit dibur. That's why I say Dvoroi, because Shemitah is expressly connected with Dibur, because the part of the mitzvah of Shemitah is V'zeh Dvar HaShemitah, to say words. With Medrash and Machriach as Etzech and Shemer Shvius. And how does the Medrash even figure out that this is talking about Shvius? Nemer kan Oisei Dvoroi. In this passage it says Oisei Dvoroi. But Nemer La'alon V'zeh Dvar HaShemitah. And later on, or earlier on, by Shemitah, it says that Shemitah ma dvar shenemer la'alon b'shem rishvius akasu medaber out dvar omer kan b'shem rishvius akasu medaber. Just like the dvar, is that dvar Shemitah is talking about Shemitah, so too I say dvarei is also talking about shem rishvius. People observe shvius. So again, we see the comparison is coming through the word dvar, not just through the word Shemitah Shamait, which said earlier. It says that was something else. Sorry. But we're connecting it because of the word dvar, because of the aspect of dibur. This makes it so much more geschmack. The fact that we end off Shvius with Kol HaMakayim is Dvorei, even though it's not talking about Shvius at all, it's talking about a kinyan of metaltalin. Nevertheless, because the whole inyan of Shvius is about Dibur, therefore we conclude that Kol HaMakayim is Dvorei, someone fulfills his Dibur, and when it comes through the fact that we are involved in learning the Lachas Shvius, what's called Esik B'Teidas Kilu Asa, which we know that whenever you involve in something, learn about something, it's as if you actually did it. Is Memar Dizman Vasartzisa Hashem Atzacha. We hasten the time when the Eibishter will show his willingness to our land, which refers to the Asu Hashmita, and that we'll be able to fulfill Shmita. Shafto Shvis Yankiv, Asvas Shviyasa the Beis Yankiv, you're going to bring back the captives of Beis Yankiv. Unagam Hashem Yitnatei Vatzen Titin Yevula, the Eibishter will give good, and our land will be able to give produce. Will be able to be the Giborim, the strong people that observe Shvius. We'll be able to fulfill Shvius in Eretz Yisrael and the Shvius Minatera. Not like today, which some aspects of Shvius are not Minatera. The card of Mamas from the Eibishter is Mekayim Zayin Dvorim. In the very spirit of the day, when the Eibishter will fulfill His word. Dvar Havaya Zaketz, the word of Hashem refers to the catch, the end of Golus. That if we do our part, we learn about Shvius, then this will hasten the time that we'll be able to fulfill the mitzvah of Shvius in Eretz Yisrael, when the Eibishter will bring us Mashiach and the Gula Mitzvah Shlema.